Hello, you're on Behind the Photo. Subscribe, leave a like, and write one word in the comments what you feel when you look at old photographs. Now take a breath. The story begins. Enjoy the watch.
The Funeral Mountains sit on the eastern edge of Death Valley in Inyo County, California. They are called the Funeral Mountains because of what they look like in the summer heat. Shimmering, colorless, final. In the early years of the 20th century, men went into those mountains to take gold out of the rock. They did it at night because the days were unsurvivable. On February 24th, 1912, at some hour in the darkness before dawn, the main cable of the aerial tramway at Keane Wonder Mine snapped. The tramway had 13 towers spanning the ravines of the Funeral Mountains. It carried 70 tons of gold ore per day down a vertical fall of 1,500 feet from the mine camp above to the mill camp below. When the cable snapped, the ore bins fell into the ravines. The mill camp was at the bottom. The mine camp was a mile above it on the mountainside. The tramway was the connection between them. The mine camp went silent. The man who had named this mine the Wonder, because finding gold here, after 8 years of nothing in the desert, was the only word he had for it, was in an Irish prison, serving 17 years for murder. He had been there since 1907, the same year the tramway started running. Tonight, we go up the mountain. At some hour in the early morning of February 24th, 1912, the main cable of the aerial tramway at Keane Wonder Mine snapped. The cable carried 70 tons of gold ore per day down 1,500 feet of mountainside in the Funeral Mountains of Death Valley. When it failed, the ore bins fell into the ravines below. The failure was not quiet. The tension in that cable, under that load, over that distance, releases instantaneously when it fails, propagating along the full length of the span in a fraction of a second. The sound is significant. Anyone near the tramway at that moment would have experienced both the sound and the physical force of the release. The miners were working. They worked at night. The mine camp at the top of the mountain was a mile above the mill camp at the bottom. The tramway was the connection between them. The repair took a month and cost $7,000. The mine operated for 5 months after the repair and then closed. The Inyo Register reported it in August of 1912 under the headline, "Noted Mine's Days Over." Keane Wonder has worked out its ore bodies. What the Inyo Register did not report was what the crew found when they reached the mine camp. The Library of Congress holds 45 photographs, 9 measured drawings, and 48 pages of data on this mine under Historic American Engineering Record, KIA 3002. The National Park Service has documented its tramway, its mill, its towers, its shafts. The Eastern California Museum in Independence holds the Inyo County records for mining operations through the 20th century. I have been through all of it. None of it describes the mine camp in the days after February 24th, 1912. This is what the record does say. Jack Keane was an Irishman. He had come to California sometime before the turn of the century and had spent the better part of a decade prospecting in the desert without significant success. 8 years of nothing. The Mojave, the Panamint Range, the Funeral Mountains. He worked them all and found silver indications and borax deposits and a great deal of empty rock. In 1903, on the eastern slope of the Funeral Mountains overlooking Death Valley, he and a Basque partner named Domingo Echerin, a one-eyed former butcher from Ballarat, were scouting what they believed was a silver deposit when Echerin noticed an outcropping of quartz in the rock. Quartz is a sign. Miners who know the desert know what quartz means. Keane investigated and found a vein of free-milling gold. He named it the Wonder Mine. After 8 years without a significant strike, the wonder was the only word available for it. The Keane Wonder Mine. The name is in every subsequent document. The claim filings, the sale agreements, the production reports, the newspaper coverage. He called it what it was, and then he sold his interest in it. And then he went back to Ireland, and then he killed a man. The sequence of these events matters. Keane and Acheron sold an initial option on the mine to a New York investor named Captain Jack Delamar for a down payment and a 1-year purchase option at the price of $160,000. Delamar had the mine assessed and found a larger gold deposit to the north that interested him more. He did not exercise his option. Keane and Acheron continued to work the claim themselves for a period, employing a handful of hard rock miners and turning a modest profit, until John F. Campbell and his business partner Homer Wilson purchased the mine and its surrounding claims in 1906. Acheron used his share to purchase a store. He went to Darwin, California, which is just west of Death Valley, and opened a shop and lived what the historical accounts describe as a happy life. I want to stay with this for a moment. 2 men found the same gold. They stood in the same place in the Funeral Mountains and identified the same quartz outcropping and understood what it meant. They filed the same claims. They sold the same mine. And then Acheron opened a store and was fine. And Keane returned to Ireland and killed someone in 1907 and went to prison for 17 years. The historical record treats Acheron's portion of the story as a footnote and Keane's as the narrative. But Acheron is the one who came home from Death Valley and was fine. It is worth noting that this is the less common outcome for a man who spent 8 years in the Mojave, looking for something that was not there. Acheron's portion of the story ends in Darwin, California, in a store. That is where it ends. Keane returned to Ireland. In 1907, the same year that Campbell and Wilson completed the construction of the aerial tramway and the stamp mill, and began serious production at the mine he had named, Jack Keane committed a murder in Ireland. The specific circumstances of the killing are not fully preserved in the accessible historical record. What is documented is the outcome. He was convicted and sentenced to 17 years in prison. He served all 17 years. I want to stop on this for a moment, because the timing is not incidental. Keane sold his interest in the mine in 1906. He returned to Ireland. In 1907, the tramway was completed and began operating. In 1907, the mine reached its peak production. And in 1907, in Ireland, Jack Keane killed someone. What connection, if any, exists between these events is not established in any record I have found. I have searched the Inyo County records for correspondence between Keane and Campbell or Wilson after the 1906 sale. I have found nothing. I have searched the accessible Irish records for the circumstances of the killing. The available documentation is partial. Irish criminal records from that period are not fully digitized, and the specific proceedings surrounding Keane's case are not in the materials I have been able to access. What the sources agree on is the year, 1907. What they do not say is whether the man he killed had any connection to the mine, to the sale, to the money, to anything that had happened in Death Valley. It may have been entirely unrelated. A man who spent years in a remote desert and then returned to his native country and the circumstances and histories of that place. There are any number of reasons such a man might kill someone that have nothing to do with California. The timing may be coincidence, but 1907 is when the tramway started running, and when the mine started earning real money, and when Jack Keane, who had named it, and found it, and sold it, killed a man in Ireland, and went to prison for 17 years. and never saw a penny of what the wonder produced during its peak. The Wonder Mine, which bore his name and which he had discovered after 8 years in the desert, reached its absolute peak of production in 1907 and held that production through 1912. It produced between $625,000 and $682,000 worth of gold during those years. Some accounts put the total higher. The mine ran without him, under the ownership of men he had sold it to, producing gold at a scale he had not been present to see, while he served his sentence in an Irish prison. The mine, under Campbell and Wilson, was an engineering operation of considerable ambition for a desert site of that period. The aerial tramway was its defining feature. It had been completed in late 1907 and began operations in October of that year. It had 13 towers, spanning the ravines of the Funeral Mountains in a series of cables and counterweights that descended 1,500 feet from the mine camp to the mill camp below. The ore buckets ran continuously during operations, carrying approximately 70 tons of gold-bearing rock down the mountain each day. Homer Wilson had brought his family to live at the mine site. He and Campbell had attempted to establish 2 small towns in the area, Keane Springs and Chloride City, shortly after acquiring the mine in 1906. Both towns failed within months. The mine continued producing regardless. It was, as the historical record consistently notes, one of the most productive gold mines in Death Valley's history, and it operated successfully through the Panic of 1907 and the subsequent economic depression, limited primarily by 2 factors: the scarcity of water in the desert and the heat. The heat is not a minor detail. Death Valley holds the record for the highest reliably recorded air temperature on Earth. In the summer months of 1907 through 1912, the floor of the valley regularly exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. On the slopes of the Funeral Mountains, where the mine camp sat, the temperatures were lower than the valley floor, but still extreme by any standard applicable to sustained physical labor. The mine camp was at approximately 2,800 feet elevation, which provided some relief. It did not provide enough. Homer Wilson's solution was to have the miners work at night. This is documented in the historical record and referenced in the National Park Service's own site documentation. The miners worked at night. It was the only rational choice. Daytime temperatures in Death Valley routinely killed people. What stays with me about this is not the heat. It is the specific character of working a mine at night in the Funeral Mountains. These were not men in a well-lit industrial operation. They were men on a steep mountainside, with no ambient light source for 50 miles in any direction, except the stars and whatever lamps they carried. The nearest town was Beatty, Nevada, 30 miles to the northeast. The 2 camps, Mill Camp and Mine Camp, were the entirety of the inhabited world for the men who worked there. They went up the mountain in the evening and worked through the night and slept in a boarding house a mile above the mill, accessible only by the tramway or by a steep trail that was manageable in daylight and significantly harder in the dark. The miners at Keane Wonder worked in darkness, in the deep desert darkness of a remote mountain in Inyo County, with no significant light source beyond what the operation itself provided, and the temperature still regularly exceeding 90 degrees, even at night during the summer months. They worked in darkness in a landscape that has no other occupation except the extraction of things from rock, with toxic materials, cyanide and mercury and lead, all used in the processing of gold ore. Present at the mill camp below, and with the only connection between the 2 camps being the tramway that ran continuously through the night, carrying 70 tons of rock down 1,500 feet of mountain. They worked at night, and they slept during the day in a boarding house at the mine camp that sat a mile above the mill camp on the steep slope of a mountain in the middle of Death Valley. On February 24, 1912, the main cable snapped. It is worth spending a moment with the physics of what this means. The aerial tramway at Keane Wonder carried 70 tons of gold ore per day. The cable supporting this load spanned 1,500 feet of vertical descent across 13 towers. The tension in a cable of that specification, under that load, over that distance, is not a small number. When such a cable fails, it does not merely go slack. It releases that tension instantaneously, and the release propagates along the full length of the cable in a fraction of a second. The sound is significant. Anyone near the tramway at the moment of failure would have experienced both the sound and the physical force of the release. It was February. It was night. The miners were working. The time is not recorded precisely in the available documents. It was sometime in the early morning hours, which means sometime during the period when the miners were working. The cable did not fail silently. A main tramway cable under the tension required to move 70 tons of ore per day does not break quietly. It fails catastrophically, and the failure is audible at significant distance. What exactly the men in the mine camp heard and saw in the darkness of the Funeral Mountains at that moment is not in any document I have found. What is documented is the physical result. The ore bins, the metal containers that rode the cable down the 1,500-foot descent, fell into the ravines below. The ravines of the Funeral Mountains are steep and deep and rocky. The bins fell, and the cable fell, and the tramway went silent, and the mine camp at the top was isolated from the mill camp at the bottom by a mile of steep mountain trail in the darkness. Someone at the mill camp, when the cable came down, would have known immediately that something had happened above. The question of what they did next, whether they attempted to reach the mine camp that night, whether they waited for daylight, what the trail up the mountainside looked like in the dark, is not answered by the documents I have located. The Inyo County records for this specific period have gaps. The production ledgers show a break in entries beginning in late February and resuming approximately 1 month later when the repairs were underway. The repairs cost $7,000 and took a month to complete. The Inyo Register documented this in its coverage of the mine's eventual closure in August of 1912. The headline read, "Noted Mines Days Over. Keane Wonder has worked out its ore bodies." The paper noted the cable break in February as a significant event in the mine's final months, describing the cost and duration of the repair and the 5-month operation that followed before the mine closed permanently. What the Inyo Register did not describe was what the crew found when they reached the mine camp in the days following the cable break. Before I describe what the record says about the days following the cable break, I want to establish what the record does not say, because the absence is as important as the presence. The Inyo Register coverage of the cable break and the mine's eventual closure is factual and brief. The newspaper was a weekly publication serving the small communities of Inyo County, and it covered the Keane Wonder Mine in the same register it used for other local business news. As an economic concern, a source of employment, a fixture of the county's commercial landscape. Its coverage of the February 1912 cable break, which appears in the August 1912 article about the mine's final closure, runs to 2 sentences. It describes the break, the cost, the duration of the repair. It does not describe the mine camp. The Western Mining History records, which are among the most comprehensive accounts of Keane Wonder's operation, available in the public record, describe the cable break in similar terms. The date, the damage, the cost. The 5 months of subsequent operation. The closure. The headline, "Noted Mines Days Over." Keane Wonder has worked out its ore bodies. The National Park Service's hair documentation, the most technically detailed record of the mine's physical features available, was compiled after the mine had been dormant for decades. It describes the tramway infrastructure in considerable detail. It does not describe the events of February 1912. I spent 3 days with the records at the Eastern California Museum in Independence, which maintains Inyo County historical materials alongside the county's own archive. The museum holds documents related to mining operations in the region from the 1870s through the mid-20th century. The Keane Wonder files are partial, not unusual for a mine that changed ownership multiple times and was subsequently managed by the National Park Service, which acquired the site in the early 1970s for approximately $1,100,000. What the Eastern California Museum holds for the Keane Wonder Mine in the period 1911 through 1913 includes production ledgers, correspondence between Wilson and Campbell regarding the mine's legal and financial situation, and one document that does not fit neatly into any of the other categories. It is a handwritten account, 4 pages, unsigned. The archivist placed it in the miscellaneous Keane Wonder folder because it fit nowhere else. It was not a production record. It was not correspondence between Campbell and Wilson. It was not a legal document. It was 4 pages of handwritten observation in a careful and somewhat formal hand, using the kind of precise language that suggests the writer had some professional relationship to the mine or to the mining industry, though no identification or credential appears anywhere in the document. I asked the archivist when she had first encountered it. She said it had been in the folder when the collection was donated in the 1960s. She did not know where it had come from or who had written it. It was simply there. It is a handwritten account, 4 pages, unsigned. The archivist who cataloged the collection dated it to approximately 1912 based on the paper and the ink, and filed it under miscellaneous Keane Wonder. It describes a visit to the mine camp in what appears to be the early days of March 1912, which would place it in the period immediately after the cable break and before the formal repair operation began. The account does not identify its author. It does not state his role or his reason for being at the mine. It begins with a description of the trail up from the mill camp, steep, approximately 1 mile, navigable in daylight with effort, and then describes what he found at the mine camp at the top. The mine camp had a boarding house, a storage building for equipment and supplies, and several smaller structures associated with the mine shafts themselves. The boarding house is described in the document as the author found it, empty of the men who should have been there. A meal had been prepared and not eaten. A lamp had burned out. And then the detail that the author returns to, twice in the following pages. Outside the boarding house, placed along the exterior wall in a row, were 7 pairs of work boots. The men who worked the mine shafts at Keane Wonder wore heavy work boots in the shafts. These were not spare boots. The author examines them and notes they show the wear consistent with regular use in the mine, caked with the pale dust of the funeral mountains, scuffed at the toes where men kneel in narrow shafts. They had been worn. They had then been placed outside the boarding house, in a row, neatly, against the wall. The author counts them. 7 pairs. He does not know the exact number of men assigned to the mine camp at the time of the cable break. The boarding house bunks numbered 12. 12 men could sleep there. He counts 7 pairs of boots and he writes it down, and he does not offer an explanation, because there is no explanation available to him. Men working at night in a mine shaft in Death Valley in February do not remove their work boots and place them outside in a row. Not at 2 in the morning, not at any hour. The author knows this. He writes it as a fact and moves on. The remainder of the document describes the mine shafts and the equipment. At the end of the third page, there is a notation that the author had spoken with two men he encountered on the trail descending from the mine camp, and that these men had refused to return with him. He writes that they gave no reason for this refusal that he found satisfactory. He notes it the same way he noted the boots, as an observation, without commentary, without speculation. They would not go back. He does not say what they had seen. The fourth page ends mid-sentence. The sentence reads, "As far as it goes, the men who remained at the mine camp had," and then it stops. The rest is not in the file. Jack Keane is not present in this document. He is in an Irish prison for the entirety of the period the document covers. This is worth noting because the mine bears his name, and because his absence from the Wonder Mine's peak years is the central fact of the mine's history that every account eventually returns to. The man who named it was not there for any of it. He was not there when the tramway was completed. He was not there when the production reached its peak. He was not there when the cable snapped and the bins fell into the ravines. He was not there when the unsigned document was written, or when its writer declined to speculate about where the men had gone. He was serving 17 years in Ireland for a killing that happened the same year his mine started working at full capacity. I have tried to find records of Keane's imprisonment in Ireland through the Irish National Archives and through the records accessible via the genealogy databases that have been digitized in recent years. The available records for Irish criminal proceedings of that period are partial. I found his name in a document that appears to be associated with an inquest or court proceeding, but cannot confirm the full context without access to records that are not currently digitized. What the available sources agree on is the duration, 17 years. What they do not agree on is the specific nature of the killing or the circumstances surrounding it. It happened in 1907. He served his time. He came back to California and built a store in Darwin, and the historical record does not describe what he said, if anything, about the mine that had produced nearly $1 million of gold while he was away. The Keane Wonder Mine is now a protected site within Death Valley National Park. The aerial tramway infrastructure remains largely intact. The towers, the cables, the terminal structures at the top and bottom of the 1,500-foot descent. The National Park Service closed the site between 2008 and 2017 for stabilization and environmental remediation. The lead, mercury, and cyanide used in the gold extraction process had contaminated the soil around the mill camp. Much of it was cleaned up. Some remains. The shafts themselves are sealed. The National Park Service seals the shafts of abandoned mines in Death Valley as a standard safety measure against both physical hazard and the contamination that is leached from the processing chemicals into the rock and soil around the mine openings. Jack Keane finished his 17-year sentence sometime in the mid-1920s. He did not return to Death Valley. The historical accounts note that he built a store in the town of Darwin, California, after completing his sentence, the same town where Sharon had built his store 2 decades earlier. Keane's later life is not extensively documented. What the record preserves is his discovery, his departure, his conviction, and his sentence. There is a question embedded in the structure of this story that I have not directly addressed, because I cannot answer it directly. What happened to the men from the mine camp after the cable snapped on February 24, 1912? The unsigned document says they were not in the boarding house. It says 2 men on the trail would not go back up and gave no satisfactory reason. It ends mid-sentence on the 4th page. The mine operated for 5 more months and then closed. The inyo register said the ore body had been worked out. Maybe it had. The mine had been operating at peak capacity for 5 years, and gold veins exhaust. The panic of 1907 had created legal and financial difficulties that followed the mine through its final years. These are sufficient explanations for a closure in August of 1912. They do not require anything else. But the repair crew went up in late February or early March of 1912, and what they found is in 4 pages of an unsigned handwritten document in the Eastern California Museum in Independence, and the 4th page ends mid-sentence, and the men from the mine camp are not accounted for in any subsequent record I have located. They may be in records I have not located. Inyo County is a large county with a partial historical archive. The Eastern California Museum has materials I was not able to review in 3 days. There are records I have not seen. The Wonder Mine produced its gold without him. It reached its peak and declined and closed, and was purchased by a national park and remediated and sealed. The tramway towers still stand on the slope of the Funeral Mountains. The ravines where the ore bins fell in the early morning of February 24th, 1912, are still there below the cables. The unsigned document in the Eastern California Museum is 4 pages long, and the 4th page ends mid-sentence. I have requested a full copy from the museum archive, and I have it in front of me. I have read it 6 times. What I can tell you is what the document says. It says the mine camp was empty of the men who should have been there. It says a lamp had burned out. It says 2 men on the trail would not go back up the mountain and did not give him a reason he found satisfactory. What it does not say is where the men from the mine camp went, or what the 2 men on the trail had seen, or what was in the mine shafts, or what happens in the darkness of the Funeral Mountains when a cable snaps and 1,500 feet of tension releases at once in the early hours of the morning, and the connection between 2 camps goes silent. The mine is sealed now. The National Park Service sealed it. The tramway towers are still standing on the slope of the Funeral Mountains, 13 of them, spanning the ravines from the mine camp at the top to the mill camp at the bottom, 1,500 feet of vertical descent. The National Park Service closed the site between 2008 and 2017 for stabilization and remediation. Cyanide, mercury, and lead in the soil around the mill camp. Cleaned what they could clean. Sealed what needed sealing. Some remains. The National Park Service documentation is clear about this. Some remains. The shafts are sealed. I stood at the bottom of the tramway in October and looked up at the towers on the mountainside. The Funeral Mountains are very quiet in October. The ravines where the ore bins fell on February 24th, 1912, are below the lowest tower. I could see the upper terminal at the top, the structure where the cable ran, where the mine camp sat a mile above in the darkness when the cable snapped, where someone placed 7 pairs of boots in a row against the wall and did not come back for them. I did not go up. Jack Keane named this mine the Wonder, because after 8 years of nothing in the desert, it was the only word available. He named it and sold it, and went back to Ireland, and killed a man, and served 17 years, and came back to California, and opened a store in Darwin. And the historical record does not say what he thought about any of it. He is not in the unsigned document. He is not in the inyo register. He is not in the 4 pages that end mid-sentence in the Eastern California Museum. The Wonder Mine made its gold without him. The 4th page ends mid-sentence. I don't know what comes after it. I've looked. It's not there.
Thank you for walking this path with me to the end. Tell me in the comments what time zone you're in right now. Let this frame leave a trace across the whole world. and subscribe to Behind the Photo. I'm already preparing the next story.